When the paramedics found her barely breathing in the garage, the police assumed it was suicide. But then they checked the insurance file and saw her son's signature. The Missouri air clung heavy with the scent of damp leaves and gasoline, a quiet October evening in the suburbs of St. Charles. Margaret Hill's small weathered house sat at the end of a cul-de-sac, its faded blue siding blending into the dusk. Inside, the walls held decades of memories. Photographs of a younger Margaret, her nurse's scrubs crisp, her smile wide, standing beside a toddler with her eyes. Jason, her only son, her everything. At 52, Margaret moved slower now, her hands rough from years of double shifts at the hospital and late nights cleaning offices. Widowed young, she'd poured every penny, every ounce of her soul into raising Jason, believing she was shaping a good man. The kitchen glowed faintly under a single bulb, casting shadows across the linoleum floor. Margaret stirred a pot of chili, Jason's favorite, humming an old hymn. Her graying hair fell loose from a bun, framing a face etched with quiet pride. She'd paid for his college, watched him graduate with honors, and told herself the sacrifices were worth it. Even now, with Jason back home at 26, unemployed and restless, she saw the boy who once clung to her hand. "He'll find his way," she'd whisper to herself, ignoring the edge in his voice when he asked for money. Jason slumped at the table, scrolling his phone, his broad shoulders hunched. Gone was the lanky kid who'd draw her Mother's Day cards. His jaw was tight, his eyes darting when she spoke. "You eating tonight, honey?" Margaret asked, her voice soft but hopeful. He grunted, not looking up. She set a bowl in front of him anyway, her fingers brushing the table's chipped edge. The silence between them felt heavier than usual, like a storm brewing, just out of sight. She didn't question his late nights out, the way he'd slip into the basement without a word. She didn't dwell on the times she caught him staring at her pill bottles, his fingers lingering on the labels. "Just checking you're okay, Mom," he'd say, and she'd nod, her heart swelling with trust. Margaret had always believed love could mend anything. Cracks in a marriage, a husband's early grave, a son's aimless anger. But love, she was beginning to sense, could also blind. One night, she woke to a creak in the hallway. The clock read 2:17 a.m. Her bedroom door was ajar, a sliver of moonlight catching the outline of Jason standing there, still as stone. "Jason?" she called, her voice thick with sleep. He didn't answer, just stepped back into the dark. The next morning, he was all smiles, handing her a coffee, asking about her day. But her desk drawer was slightly open, papers shifted. "Looking for a pen?" he mumbled when she asked, his eyes avoiding hers. Margaret smiled, but her chest tightened. Something was wrong. She started noticing other things. Her keys went missing, only to reappear on the counter. Her bank statements, usually tucked in a locked box, were out of order. Once she caught Jason on the phone, his voice low, talking about payouts and accidents. When she walked in, he hung up fast, flashing a grin that didn't reach his eyes. "Just a friend," he said. Margaret wanted to believe him. She wanted to believe the boy she'd raised, the one who'd cried in her arms when his father died, was still there. But doubt, sharp and cold, was creeping in. Her body felt it too. She was tired, more than usual, her thoughts foggy. The sleeping pills her doctor prescribed worked too well, pulling her into a dreamless void. Jason was always there, handing her the pills with a glass of water. "You need to rest, Mom," he'd say, his voice almost tender. She'd swallow them, trusting, because what mother wouldn't? But the fog in her mind grew thicker, moments slipping away like water through her fingers. If you're gripped by Margaret's story, don't miss what's coming next. Subscribe to our channel for more heart-pounding tales of betrayal and survival. She sat alone one evening, staring at a photo of Jason as a child, his gap-toothed grin beaming up at her. The house was quiet, too quiet, the kind of silence that presses against your skin. Margaret traced the photo with her thumb, her heart aching. She'd given him everything, her youth, her savings, her trust. But as the days passed, that trust began to crack, and a question she couldn't shake took root. What if the son she loved was no longer hers? Margaret's mornings began with a haze, as if her mind were wading through molasses. She'd wake in her narrow bed, the Missouri dawn filtering through threadbare curtains, her head pounding, her thoughts scattered like leaves in a storm. At first, she blamed age. 52 wasn't young, and years of double shifts had worn her down. but the gaps in her memory were new, unnerving. Whole conversations vanished. She'd find herself standing in the kitchen, unsure how she got there, a spoon in her hand with no memory of picking it up. Her doctor had upped her sleeping pills months ago, after the stress of Jason's return home began to fray her nerves. "Take these, Mom," Jason would say each night, handing her a small white tablet and a glass of water. His voice was gentle, almost too gentle, like a stranger mimicking care. She'd swallow, trusting him because he was her son. But trust was a fragile thing, and it was cracking. Margaret started noticing how Jason's eyes lingered on her pill bottles, how he'd ask, "You feeling okay, Mom?" with a tone that felt rehearsed. She caught him once, late at night, standing by her dresser, the amber bottle of her medication in his hand. "Just making sure you've got enough," he said, slipping it back into place. His smile was tight, his fingers twitching. Margaret nodded, her throat dry, but the image stuck, a snapshot of doubt she couldn't shake. The house felt different now, its familiar creaks and shadows turning sinister. She'd find her bank statements rearranged, her locked box left ajar. One afternoon, she overheard Jason on the phone in the basement, his voice low and sharp. "Yeah, it's a lot. No, she doesn't know." When she called down, he emerged too quickly, his face flushed, claiming it was a job interview. Margaret wanted to believe him, but her gut twisted. She'd raised him, bandaged his scraped knees, stayed up nights when he was sick. How could she doubt her own blood? Yet the question gnawed. What was he hiding? Her body gave her the first clue. The fatigue wasn't just tiredness, it was a weight, a fog that dulled her senses. She'd forget appointments, misplace her phone, lose hours to a blank stare. One morning she dropped a mug, watching it shatter on the kitchen floor, her hands shaking too hard to pick up the pieces. Jason was there, too fast, cleaning up with a sigh. "You're not yourself, Mom. Maybe you need a stronger dose." His words were kind, but his eyes were cold, scanning her like she was a problem to solve. That night, Margaret didn't take the pill. She palmed it, tucking it into her pocket as Jason watched, oblivious. She lay awake, staring at the ceiling, her heart pounding with a clarity she hadn't felt in weeks. The next day, she drove to the small medical lab where she'd worked as a nurse years ago. The building was unchanged, its sterile halls smelling of antiseptic and coffee. Her old colleague, Dr. Ellen Carter, greeted her with a warm hug. "Maggie, you look exhausted," Ellen said, her brow furrowing. Margaret hesitated, then slid the pill across the counter. "Can you test this? I need to know what's in it." Ellen called 2 days later, her voice tight. "It's your prescription, but it's been tampered with. There's a sedative mixed in, a strong one, enough to cause memory loss over time. Maggie, this isn't an accident." The words hit like a punch, stealing Margaret's breath. She sat in her car, gripping the steering wheel, the world tilting. Jason, her Jason, was poisoning her, not just her body, but her mind, erasing her piece by piece. If she died, no one would question it. If she lived, she'd be a shell, unable to point a finger. She drove home, her hands trembling, and went straight to Jason's room. He was out, the basement door locked as usual. She'd never dared search his space before, but now fear and fury pushed her forward. She found a spare key in the kitchen drawer and descended the stairs, her pulse loud in her ears. His room was a mess, empty beer cans, crumpled papers, a laptop left open. On the desk, half hidden under a hoodie, was a document. Her heart stopped as she read it. A life insurance policy, $250,000, with Jason as the sole beneficiary. Her signature was there, shaky, dated months ago, but she hadn't signed it. She'd never seen it before. Margaret sank to the floor, the paper clutched in her hands. Flashes of memory came back. Nights when she'd been groggy, Jason hovering, saying, "Just sign this, Mom, it's nothing." Had he guided her hand, drugged and half-conscious? The betrayal cut deeper than any knife, a wound that bled trust. Her son, the boy she'd given everything, was betting on her death. If this story of a mother's broken trust has you hooked, hit that subscribe button to follow Margaret's fight for truth. Don't miss what's next. She sat there, the policy crumpling in her grip as the weight of it settled in. Jason wasn't just drifting, he was calculating, cold, a stranger wearing her son's face. But Margaret wasn't done. She'd survived worse, grief, poverty, a life of scraping by. If Jason thought he could break her, he'd underestimated the woman who raised him. The garage smelled of oil and rust, a cramped space cluttered with old paint cans and a lawnmower that hadn't run in years. Margaret rarely came out here, but that night, October's chill had driven her to fetch a blanket from the storage shelves. She'd felt unsteady, her legs heavy, the fog in her mind thicker than ever. The sleeping pills. She hadn't taken one that night, but the residue of weeks lingered, dulling her senses. She remembered opening the car door, thinking she'd sit for a moment to catch her breath. The keys were in the ignition, though she didn't recall turning them. The engine hummed, a low, steady growl, and the garage door was shut tight, sealing her in with the invisible poison of carbon monoxide. She woke to the wail of sirens, her chest tight, her vision swimming. Red and blue lights pulsed through the garage window, casting jagged shadows. Paramedics knelt over her, their voices sharp, urgent. "Margaret, can you hear me? Stay with us." An oxygen mask pressed against her face, cold and plastic, forcing air into her lungs. She tried to speak, but her throat was raw, her thoughts a jumbled mess. How did she get here? Why was the car running? Her eyes darted to the edge of the chaos, where Jason stood, his face pale, his hands wringing. "I found her like this," he told the police officer, his voice breaking just enough to sound convincing. I thought she was gone." The paramedics loaded her onto a stretcher, the world tilting as they wheeled her out. Jason followed, his footsteps close, his hand brushing her arm. "You're going to be okay, Mom," he said, loud enough for the neighbors gathered on the lawn to hear. Mrs. Callahan from next door clutched her robe, whispering to her husband, "Poor Margaret, all alone like that." Jason nodded solemnly, his eyes glistening with tears that never fell. Margaret caught his gaze for a moment, searching for the boy she knew, but his face was a mask, perfectly crafted, perfectly false. In the hospital, the sterile white walls closed in, the beep of monitors a relentless reminder of her survival. She drifted in and out, fragments of the night flickering like a broken film reel, the car running, the garage door shut. Jason's voice calling 911, but too calm, too controlled. She remembered his silhouette in the doorway, watching her slump in the driver's seat before he found her. Had he planned it? Had he turned the key, closed the door, and waited? The thought clawed at her, but her mind was too foggy to hold it. The doctor said she was lucky. Another 10 minutes, and she'd have been gone. Carbon monoxide was a silent killer, they explained. Odorless, undetectable. A suicide, the police officer suggested gently, noting her recent stress. Margaret shook her head weakly. She hadn't wanted to die. Had she? Jason was there every day, bringing coffee, sitting by her bed with a concerned frown. "I was so scared, Mom," he'd say, squeezing her hand. The nurses cooed over him, calling him a devoted son. But Margaret saw the way his eyes flicked to the monitors, the way his fingers tapped impatiently when he thought she was asleep. She pretended to rest, her lids half closed, watching him through the blur of her lashes. Once, he pulled out his phone, texting rapidly, his lips curling into a faint smile when he thought no one was looking. Who was he texting? What was he planning next? Her body ached, her lungs burned, but her mind was clearing. The fog of the past weeks was lifting, replaced by a cold, sharp fear. She'd trusted Jason with her life, her home, her heart, but the garage wasn't an accident. She knew it in her bones, even if the police didn't. The officer had asked about her mental health, her finances, hinting at desperation. She wanted to scream that she wasn't desperate. She was betrayed. But she had no proof, not yet. Only a mother's instinct, screaming that the son she loved had tried to kill her. If Margaret's fight for survival has you on the edge of your seat, subscribe now to follow her journey to uncover the truth. Don't miss the next chapter. Days passed, and Margaret grew stronger, though her heart felt heavier with each visit from Jason. She smiled at his stories, nodded at his promises to take care of her, but inside, she was piecing together the puzzle. The car, the pills, the insurance policy. She hadn't told anyone about that yet, not even the police. She needed to be sure, to catch him in a way he couldn't slip free. As she lay in the hospital bed, staring at the ceiling, a plan began to form. She'd survived once, she'd survive again, and this time she'd make sure Jason paid for what he'd done. The hospital room was a cage of white walls and antiseptic air, but for Margaret Hill, it was a crucible. Each day her body grew stronger, her lungs clearing the poison that had nearly claimed her. Yet her heart carried a heavier burden, one no doctor could mend. The memory of the garage, the car's low hum, the sealed door, Jason's two perfect tears haunted her. She lay still, her eyes tracing cracks in the ceiling, piecing together fragments of a truth too monstrous to fully grasp. Her son had tried to kill her, and he'd almost succeeded. Discharged after a week, Margaret returned to the house that no longer felt like home. The familiar creak of the floorboards, the lavender scent she'd once loved, now felt like a trap. Jason was there, waiting, his concern a polished performance. "I'll take care of you, Mom," he said, setting a tray of soup by her bedside. His smile was warm, but his eyes were sharp, watching her every move. Margaret nodded, her own smile a mask to match his. She couldn't confront him, not yet. She needed proof, something solid to shatter the lie he'd built. Her first step was small but deliberate. In the kitchen, she tucked a voice recorder under the table, its tiny red light hidden in the shadows. She'd bought it from a drugstore near the hospital, her hands shaking as she paid. Each evening, as Jason rambled about his day, job applications he never submitted, friends she'd never met, she let the device capture his words. Most were mundane, but some carried a weight that chilled her. "You don't need to worry about money, Mom," he said one night, his voice low. "Everything's going to be fine soon." She smiled, stirring her tea, but her pulse raced. Fine for who? Her next move was riskier. Jason was out one afternoon, claiming a job interview. Margaret waited until his car disappeared down the street, then slipped into the basement. His room was a chaos of dirty clothes and empty cans, but her eyes went to his laptop, left open on the desk. Her fingers hesitated over the keyboard. She'd never invaded his privacy before. But the mother who trusted blindly was gone, replaced by a woman fighting for her life. She typed his password, a guess based on his childhood dog's name. It worked. The screen lit up with emails, dozens of them, to an insurance agent named Carla Reed. Margaret's breath caught as she read. "What if the cause of death is unclear?" Jason had written. "Would the payout still go through?" Carla's reply was clinical. "As long as the policy is active, the beneficiary receives the funds." Margaret scrolled further, her heart sinking. Another email, dated weeks before the garage incident, asked about increasing the policy's value. Attached was a scanned document, her signature, shaky and uneven, on a form she'd never seen. She printed the email, her hands trembling, and drove to the insurance office the next day. The building was a bland strip mall office, its waiting room smelling of stale coffee. Carla Reed, a middle-aged woman with tired eyes, pulled up the file. "This is your signature, Mrs. Hill," she said, sliding the paper across the desk. Margaret stared at it, her stomach twisting. The date, March 17th, was the day after she'd fallen down the stairs. She remembered that fall now, the sudden shove she'd dismissed as a misstep, Jason's hands steadying her too quickly. She'd been groggy for days after, medicated, barely conscious. "Was anyone with me when I signed this?" Margaret asked, her voice steady despite the storm inside. Carla frowned, checking her notes. "Your son brought a witness, a family friend. They said you were recovering, but aware." A family friend. Margaret had no such friend. The realization hit like a blade. Jason had staged the fall, drugged her, guided her hand across the paper while she was half conscious, a puppet in his scheme. He hadn't just planned her death. He'd orchestrated her betrayal, down to the smallest detail. Back home, Margaret sat in her bedroom, the printed email and insurance form spread before her. Tears stung her eyes, but she blinked them away. Crying wouldn't undo what Jason had done. She remembered the boy who'd clung to her after his father's funeral, his small hands clutching her dress. That boy was gone, replaced by a stranger who saw her as a means to an end. The policy, the pills, the garage, they weren't accidents. They were a plan, cold and calculated, to trade her life for $250,000. But Margaret wasn't finished. She'd survived the garage, the drugs, the fall. She'd survived this too. She hid the recorder and the documents in a locked box under her bed, her resolve hardening. Jason thought he'd outsmarted her, but he'd forgotten who she was. A nurse, a mother, a woman who'd fought for everything she had. She'd play his game, let him think she was weak, until she could trap him in his own lies. Margaret Hill had spent her life piecing people back together, bandaging wounds, soothing fevers, holding hands through pain. Now, in the quiet of her Missouri home, she was stitching together something else, a trap for her own son. The locked box under her bed held her evidence: the recorded conversations, the printed emails, the insurance form with its damning signature. But evidence wasn't enough. Jason was slippery, his lies polished by months of practice. She needed to catch him in a way that left no room for escape, a way that would force the truth into the open. For that, she needed help. She found it in Tom Kessler, a private investigator recommended by her old colleague, Ellen Carter. Tom was a grizzled man in his late 50s, with a gravelly voice and eyes that had seen too many betrayals. They met in a diner on the edge of St. Charles, the kind of place where the coffee was bitter and the booths were sticky. Margaret slid her evidence across the table, her hands steady despite the ache in her chest. Tom studied the papers, his jaw tightening as he listened to the recordings. Jason's voice, smooth and calculated, asking about payouts and accidents. "This is enough to raise flags," Tom said, leaning back. "But to nail him, we need him to act. We need him to show his hand." The plan was audacious, born of desperation and a mother's broken heart. Margaret would die again, not in a garage, but in a staged accident, one that would lure Jason to claim his prize. Tom knew a contact at the coroner's office, a discreet woman willing to play along for the right price. They'd fake a car crash, a single-vehicle accident on a quiet road, with Margaret as the supposed victim. The police would be informed, but only enough to make it look real. The coroner's report would list her as deceased, and Jason would be notified. If he took the bait, asked about the insurance money, he'd walk into a trap. Margaret spent sleepless nights preparing. She wrote a will, leaving everything to a local charity, ensuring Jason would get nothing if the plan failed. She recorded a final message, her voice trembling but clear, stored on a USB drive for Tom. "If this goes wrong, make sure he pays." The hardest part was staying in the house with Jason, pretending nothing had changed. She cooked his meals, smiled at his lies, all while her heart screamed. Each night, she checked the recorder, capturing more of his careless words. "Soon as I get a job, Mom, I'll pay you back," he'd say, his eyes darting to her pill bottle. She nodded, her stomach churning, knowing he was waiting for her to die. The accident was set for a foggy November morning. Tom arranged everything: a wrecked car, a staged scene, a police report that wouldn't raise questions. Margaret stayed hidden in a motel across town, her pulse racing as she waited for news. Tom called at dawn. "It's done." He got the call from the coroner. Margaret closed her eyes, picturing Jason's face. Would it be grief or greed? She didn't have to wait long. Tom's next update came hours later. Jason had called the insurance company, his voice shaking with false sorrow, asking about the payout timeline. "He's headed to the coroner's office now," Tom said. "We've got him." The trap closed at the county morgue, a cold, gray building that smelled of bleach and finality. Jason arrived, his face pale, his hands stuffed in his pockets. He spoke to the coroner's assistant, a woman in on the plan, asking about next steps and paperwork. His voice cracked, but his questions were precise. "How soon can the insurance process start?" The assistant stalled, offering vague answers, while Tom and two plainclothes officers waited in the next room. When Jason pressed harder, "I need to know about the $250,000. The officers stepped in, cuffs ready. His face froze, the mask slipping as he realized he'd been caught. Margaret watched it unfold from a security feed in Tom's office, her hands clasped so tightly her knuckles whitened. She'd wanted to believe, even now, that Jason might show remorse, might hesitate. But his words, his cold focus on the money, shattered that hope. She drove to the police station, her heart a storm of grief and resolve. In the interrogation room, Jason sat slumped, his bravado gone. The officers let her in, a rare courtesy, and she stood across from him, the table between them a chasm no mother could cross. "I gave you everything," she said, her voice low, steady, each word a blade, "and you still thought I was worth more dead than alive." Jason's eyes widened, his mouth opening, but no words came. For the first time, he looked small, not the calculating stranger, but the boy who'd failed her. Margaret turned away, her eyes dry, her heart empty. She'd loved him once. Now she'd bury that love and walk away. The courtroom smelled of polished wood and stale coffee, a sterile stage for a story that had torn Margaret Hill's life apart. She sat in the back row, her hands folded in her lap, her graying hair pulled into a tight bun. The trial was brief, the evidence overwhelming, The recorded conversations, the tampered pills, the insurance emails, the coroner's trap, it all painted a picture the jury couldn't ignore. Jason sat at the defendant's table, his shoulders slumped, his eyes fixed on the floor. He didn't look at her, not once, even as the judge read the verdict, guilty of attempted murder and fraud. 7 years in prison, a sentence that felt both too long and too short. Margaret listened, her face still, her heart a quiet ache. She'd wanted justice, not revenge, but the weight of it brought no relief. Her son was gone, not just to a cell, but to a place her love could no longer reach. She left Missouri the next week, the house sold in a blur of paperwork and packed boxes. The lavender-scented rooms, the chipped kitchen table, the garage where she'd nearly died, all were left behind, ghosts of a life she couldn't reclaim. She chose a small town in Oregon, drawn to its misty forests and quiet beaches, a place where the air felt clean, untainted by betrayal. Her new home was a modest apartment, its walls bare but for a single photo, her younger self, smiling as a nurse before grief and greed had reshaped her world. She didn't hang pictures of Jason. That wound was too raw, too deep. Margaret found purpose in unexpected places. A local community center advertised a support group for victims of domestic abuse, and she attended one rainy afternoon, her steps hesitant. The room was warm, filled with faces that mirrored her own, worn, resilient, carrying stories of trust broken by those closest to them. She listened, then shared, her voice steady as she spoke of the pills, the garage, the son who'd valued her life at $250,000. The group embraced her, their stories weaving a fragile but fierce bond. She began volunteering, then leading sessions, her nursing instincts guiding her to help others heal. "You're not alone," she'd tell them, her eyes kind but firm, "and you're stronger than you know." Her days took on a new rhythm. Mornings were spent at the center, afternoons reading or tending a small garden on her balcony. She'd plant lavender, she decided, not to forget, but to reclaim the scent for herself. The fog that had clouded her mind was gone, replaced by a clarity that felt like sunlight after a storm. She wasn't the woman who'd trusted blindly, nor the one who'd lain helpless in a hospital bed. She was something new, forged in pain, but not defined by it. One crisp autumn day, Margaret walked through a park near her apartment, the leaves a riot of gold and crimson under a pale sky. The air was cool, carrying the promise of rain. She moved slowly, her coat loose around her thin frame, her face serene despite the lines etched by years of sacrifice. A young mother pushed a stroller nearby, her laughter mingling with her child's. Margaret paused, watching them, a pang of memory stirring. Jason at that age, his hand in hers, his trust absolute. She let the memory pass like a leaf carried by the wind. She stopped by a bench, her breath visible in the chilly air, and looked out at the horizon. The betrayal had nearly ended her, but it hadn't. Her own blood had turned against her, but she'd survived. What mattered now was not the story Jason had tried to write for her, one that ended in a garage or a forged signature. What mattered was the chapter she was writing now, each step a choice, each day a defiance. You can survive betrayal, she thought. You can survive your own blood turning against you. What matters is not who tried to end your story, but how you chose to write the next chapter.